Hello, and welcome to the Victoria Forum. I'm Saul Klein, Dean of the Gustafson School of Business at the University of Victoria and Chair of the Victoria Forum. Established in 2017, the Victoria Forum brings together change makers in the search for solutions to the pressing problems facing our people and our planet.
The Victoria Forum will bring together policymakers, business leaders, academics, youth community groups, non-governmental organizations, and Indigenous communities to generate ideas for a better world.
We are at a time right now where humanity is facing critical environmental problems. With the pandemic that we are currently facing, we are seeing a change in the climate as humanity is being forced to live a cleaner and healthier life. We have given Mother Earth a chance to heal, but we need to continue our efforts to protect and preserve her, not only for our own sakes, but for our future generations.
Our discussions are intended to be evidence-based and inclusive of different perspectives, but united by a common purpose of wanting to make a difference. As our country's chamber of sober second thought, the Senate is a perfect partner for this enterprise.
I am delighted to be part of the advisory team that is putting together the Victoria Forum, and I very much look forward to these discussions and look forward to your participation.
The Virtual Victoria Forum is positioned to curate learnings, questions, and shared experiences in the face of uncertainties. Join us as we explore new learnings and perspectives.
I hope we can all look forward to continuing the conversation and developing solutions for a better world at the University of Victoria. Thank you.
Well, welcome everyone to today's seminar on trust and globalization. Bienvenue à tous et merci d'être avec nous aujourd'hui pour un webinaire du Forum de Victoria sur la confiance dans la réalisation. We have an amazing this morning, today, and this topic is certainly very close to my heart as a Canadian diplomat. Not only do we have great panelists from around the world, but all of you are coming together from around the world, and I'm pleased to report that our registration shows that you're spread out over 25 different countries. So that's truly a great way to set the table for a great conversation on trust in globalization. Bonjour, je m'appelle Sébastien Beaulieu, je suis co-président associé du Forum de Victoria et ambassadeur du Canada au Sénégal, et il me fait plaisir de vous présenter aujourd'hui le panel d'aujourd'hui. My name is Sébastien Beaulieu. I'm Canada's ambassador to Senegal and associate co-chair of the Victoria Forum. The Victoria Forum, you heard it, is a great and novel partnership between the University of Victoria and the Senate of Canada, un partenariat unique entre le Sénat du Canada et l'Université de Victoria. Et le webinaire d'aujourd'hui vous est présenté en collaboration avec le Asia Pacific Foundation du Canada et le Euro-Mediterranean Economists Association. Today's webinar is brought to you by the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, as well as the Euro-Mediterranean Economists Association. With that, I'm very pleased to turn it over to Christine Nakamura, Vice President of the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. Over to you, Christine. Thank you. Merci.
Thank you very kindly for your introduction, Ambassador. On behalf of the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, I'd like to thank Dr. Klein and the Victoria Forum for allowing me to say a few words and to take part in this very timely discussion about bridging divides, trust in globalization. It is indeed no secret that the acceleration of globalization over the last 20 years has come with its share of problems. Climate change, mass displacement, economic reordering, and surges in undocumented asylum seekers fleeing any number of terrible tragedies immediately come to mind. Understandably, such concerns have given us cause to ponder the merits of interconnectivity. Is bringing us closer together really worth it if it also tears us apart? Today, This question is more pressing than at any time in modern memory. Surely the sudden incursion of COVID-19 into the lives of every single human on this planet provides the ultimate impetus for us to rethink our present ways. Even in these most uncertain times, however, we cannot afford to cast aside all the good that globalization has wrought. The Asia-Pacific region, the general geographic focus of our foundation, has benefited tremendously from globalization, resulting in remarkable economic growth over the past 10 to 20 years. In just one generation, hundreds of millions of people have been lifted out of extreme poverty. Productivity and consumption have grown exponentially throughout the region, and today Asia is a leader in many of the world's most competitive sectors. So while these results alone evidence the merits of us coming together, we cannot forget that such developments have also yielded tremendous benefits for Canadian businesses that have managed to tap into this rapidly growing economic opportunity. These opportunities do not lie in trade alone, however. Today, the world's best minds are working together to try and find a cure for the present COVID-19 menace. From Toronto to Shanghai, scientists are collaborating in the hunt for the vaccine that may allow us to return to life as it once was. Made possible by the same interconnectivity that gave us this curse, the immense innovative power that flows through these researchers is the same power that runs our modern economy. Innovation and collaboration are the lifeblood of the global economy, and these depend crucially on our ability to reach out to each other quickly, even over vast distances. While the future may seem dark and uncertain for now, one thing is for certain, is that the sun will dawn again upon us one day. But that can only happen if we continue to work together in the name of a better collective future. I want to end on the note that Canada can play an important role in bridging the divide, and to ensure continued prosperity for Canadians, we need to sustain our economic globalization efforts. Deepening economic engagement, in particular with the Asia-Pacific region, which is estimated to host 65% of the world's middle class by 2030, and contain 4 of the top 10 economies by 2050, will be key to our future prosperity. Now, I am delighted to introduce to you our moderator for today's forum, the Right Honourable Lord Jack Mcconnell, Chancellor of Stirling University since June 2019. Lord Mcconnell, a former Scottish politician, was the longest-serving First Minister of Scotland from 2001 to 2007, before being appointed to the House of Lords as Lord Mcconnell of Glenscorraldale in 2010. As the member of the Scottish Parliament for Motherwell and Wishaw from 1999 to 2011, he served in a number of capacities, including in Cabinet as Minister of Education, Europe and External Affairs, and Minister for Finance. From 2008 to 2010, he was Prime Minister Gordon Brown's Special Representative for Peacebuilding, supporting UK efforts at capacity building of international institutions in conflict prevention and resolution. In 2015, he became Vice President of UNICEF UK and has been an advisor to the Clinton-Hunter Development Initiative in Malawi and Rwanda, and an ambassador for Action for Children UK. He's an honorary fellow of the Chinese Icebreakers and holds a non-doc from University of Stirling. He has authored a number of books, including Now's the Hour, New Thinking for Holyrood, Respect, Responsibility and Rehabilitation in Modern Scotland, as well as Scotland's Future, Thinking for the Long Term, just to name a few. It is now my distinct honor and privilege to introduce to you the Right Honourable Lord Jack Mcconnell. Jack, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Christine. And thank you to everybody at the Victoria Forum and the sponsors of this event and the series of webinars for enlightening our conversations at this critical time for each of our individual nations, but also for our global community as well. I think if we had been holding this webinar 12 months ago, we would probably have started the discussion by saying that we were in a time of great change, at a time when global institutions perhaps lack the trust and authority that they maybe once had, at a time when there was a real debate about the benefits or otherwise of globalization or nationalism. Well, 12 months on, these issues are, of course, even more acute and very real for every country in the world, as we have seen a global pandemic shut down national economies and international travel and have an impact on every generation in almost every nation on the planet, bringing, I think, to the fore the interdependence of our world today and the need to find global solutions, but also global solutions that feel relevant in every individual nation and community. And that is a huge challenge for policymakers, for academics, for politicians, for economists, for business leaders, diplomats, and of course, so many others. And I'm absolutely delighted that today, for our discussion and Q&A, we have, as I understand it, amongst the ranks of those who have joined us, people from over 25 different countries, but we have three outstanding, excellent speakers who come from different parts of the world and different backgrounds, but all of whom will enrich our conversation and hopefully share knowledge and insight that will help us all to develop our judgment and our vision for the future. This webinar has as a theme bridging divides and trusting globalization, and it's particularly designed to focus on people movements, especially migration, trade in goods and services, which has of course was under threat anyway, but is now of course being threatened also by the close down of certain routes as a result of the pandemic. And then of course capital flows and the vital importance of capital flows, of financial investment, the role of the private sector around the world, which of course, as ever, can be much more significant than government spending and government decision making. So these are huge issues for us, and they come at an important time in 2020, but also at an important time in the early part of the 21st century, where we are asking real questions about the kind of world we want to live in and how each of our nations relate to the global whole. The first speaker that we have today is Professor Rim Ayadi, and the format we're going to take is there'll be a brief introduction from each of the three panelists, followed by the opportunity to have a question and answer discussion. I think you're asked to put your questions in the Q&A section on the website, and we will try and group them together and identify themes of interest that I will then put to the panelists in the discussion that will follow. And we hope, therefore, that we'll manage to get as many topics and issues covered as possible, and it will be as relevant for you as I'm sure it's going to be for those of us who've been organising it. So the first speaker is Professor Rim Ayadi, who is the founder and president of the Euro-Mediterranean Economists Association, also founder and director of the Euro-Mediterranean Network for Economic Studies. Rim has a number of appointments, both now and in the past, that have made her one of the leading specialists on banking and the banking architecture. And she, amongst other things, is a senior advisor to the Economic Policy Unit of the Centre for European Policy Studies. She's the elected chair of the European Banking Authority's Banking Stakeholders Group. She is the European Commission's she's on the European Commission's Financial Services User Group, and she's the founder and co-chair of the International Workshop on Financial System Architecture and Stability, an annual conference that provides a forum for discussing these critical issues. She's a wide range of experience and authority on these topics, and I'd like to ask Rim to kick off a discussion with the first introduction today.
Thank you very much, and I'm extremely honored to be one of the partners of this Victoria Forum webinar, which is a great partnership that we have started with the Victoria Forum, and we hope to continue this collaboration. So starting my comments, I think this is an extremely important topic. In fact, amidst the COVID-19 global pandemic, which is really driving opposite trends, where both globalization and anti-globalization tensions remain. My introductory remarks will focus on 3 points, so I'll try to stick to my 5 minutes the current situation in the globalization trends, the way forward, and then I will put a focus on Europe, to a certain extent Middle East and Africa, because this is really the target region for the Euro-Mediterranean Economists Association. So basically the current situation is really the global health crisis, and the policy responses to contain it are causing major economic disruptions. It's a really a global shock in demand and supply, and also, of course, the decline in international flows in terms of capital, products, and people in fact in modern history. So we haven't seen this before in modern history. Looking at the indicators commonly used when assessing globalization trends, the current global forecasts between optimistic and pessimistic forecasts or scenarios by international organizations are showing that for 2020, averages are really showing between 13 to 32% decline in terms of product trades, up to 40% reduction in terms of foreign direct investments, up to 80% drops in the international airline passengers, more than 20% drop in remittances. Adding to this, a major drop in revenues in tourism, dramatic reduction in migration flows, and also dramatic losses of jobs. And this is really hurting very much not only Europe, but also Africa. Now, these numbers are quite dramatic, yes, it's true, but it also implies a major rollback on globalization trends. If in fact we compare it to prior to COVID-19 situation, but also we have to be careful because it might not signal a total collapse of international market integration, especially if the traditional definition of market global integration is revisited. In fact, while adding new dimensions of this global integration in terms of digital, for example, the surge of global currencies, digital interaction via web-based solutions and e-commerce. So I think this also will move the definition of market integration forward. And this takes me to the way forward, and I have a couple of points to make. First of all is to monitor in the next few months up to probably, up to we find a solution for the global pandemic, the role of global organizations, such as, for example, the big tech, the global financial institutions, for example, Amazon, Alibaba, Unilever, and so on, but how they would manage the COVID-19 pandemic, but also these global organizations would drive the future of globalization going forward. Now, the second point is to rethink the global region and supply chain, supply value chains. New models will emerge, moving from, in fact, efficiency to resilience, and trying to find the appropriate trade-off between redundancy versus reshoring. This is the whole debate nowadays. One certainty emerges is that the industries of primary necessity will be moved onshore and close by to contribute to offering a resilient response to extreme external shocks, such as, for example, agri-food, health, pharma, and other security-related industries. The third point in terms of the going forward is global political economy will continue evolving between what we call the frictions and vulnerabilities. And this is heightened by the relationship between US and China, which will add to the uncertainties, leading to major volatility and in capital flow, especially in the financial market. The fourth point is the tension led by the protectionism and anti-migration movements that will gain and further gain tractions and might lead to much lower flows of capital. The fifth point is the technological shifts and digitalization trends and how they would be accelerated in several domains. For example, in finance, we see it every day. There are security issues that need to be very carefully looked at. Health, also e-health systems nowadays developing, these applications and so on. E-commerce, education, conferencing, provision of labors, etc., etc. So digitalization, technological shifts will change the way we look at things. Sixth point is the capacity of international organizations to provide a renewed, stable, resilient, inclusive, and sustainable approach to multilateralism, anchored in global solidarity that should leave no country and no one behind. Now, just a very few focus on Europe, Middle East, and Africa, because we are dealing with this for the moment. I want to share with you a few points as well. Europe has shown to the world that EU regional integration matters and it is developing, despite the painful Brexit, and can be advanced during the hardship situations. The recovery plan approved by the EU institution is clear evidence for regional solidarity and unity in the making. The second point is the Green Deal and the digitalization initiatives led by the European Union will be moving economic models forward, and not only a growth strategy, but a lifeline out of the crisis. And this was the words of the European Commission Vice President for the European Green Deal at the annual conference that I watched in Bruegel yesterday. The third point is the EU role in smoothing out the tensions between China and the US. Rivalries will have certainly negative repercussions on regions such as Africa and also the Middle East. And finally, for Africa, I think the role of the African Free Trade Agreement between the 54 countries, I think it's very important to drive also the new partnership with the European Union. And then this will probably drive regional integration forward, but Africa also has to benefit from global regional solidarity to recover from the health and economic crisis, while cleaning up their debt burden and adhere to full transparency when borrowing from the world and invest in digital infrastructure to accelerate the digital transition. While, of course, all of this caring for correcting past globalization models anchored in extreme capitalist philosophies to deal with inequality, pollution-led growth models, respectively, via global social protection schemes that need to be defined, that are also accessible to all, and also clear plans to comply with the Paris climate targets. So these are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ayadi. A very comprehensive introduction for us. Our second speaker, our second panelist is Dr. Yasuyuki Sawada, who joins us from Manila. I should have said, sorry, Professor Ayadi was joining us from Barcelona, but Dr. Sawada joins us from Manila. He is the chief economist at the Asian Development Bank, and he also serves as Director General of the Economic Research and Regional Cooperation Department, which publishes the ADB's flagship knowledge products, such as the Asian Development Outlook. Dr. Sawada has 20 years of experience as an economist, researcher and academic. He's worked at the ADB Institute in Tokyo. He's been a consultant for the World Bank. He's been a visiting professor at Stanford, and he's been an adjunct professor of economics at Korea University. He has a wide range of experience. He's published widely on these topics and received a number of awards for his work. And we look forward very much to having his and the ADB's overview of the impact of 2020 on the countries of this planet. Yasu, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jack, for a very nice introduction. And also, I really appreciate the Victoria Forum for having me today. I'd like to mention, like Rim, I'd like to mention 3 points. Before talking about the COVID, I'd like to a little bit step back and provide a broader view. Number one is benefits of globalization, especially in Asian context. Number two, cost of globalization. And then number three, I'd like to a little bit touch upon globalization and COVID. So the first point, benefit of globalization, in the Second World War world, Asia has been the really a number one beneficiary of globalization. Especially by the 1990s, most Asian economies liberalized trade and investment using foreign direct investment FDI as a source of capital and new technology. So developing Asia achieve trade growth, annual 11% growth of amount of exports and imports in last 5 years. And also inward FDI, foreign direct investment expanded really rapidly from second half of 1980s. Asian Pacific region is one of the world's most popular FDI destination, not to mention. And the global and regional trade has entered a new phase since the early 2000s, around 20 years ago. As tariffs worldwide fell dramatically, free trade agreements proliferated, and also China, People Republic China, and other countries joined the WTO, World Trade Organization. Then global and regional multilateral firms increasingly outsource the production to Asia, integrating regional economies more deeply into global value chain. So iPhone is a typical example, parts and different components from a wide variety of countries within the region as well as outside of Asian Pacific region. And so this GVC developments and largely benefit of globalization, for Asia, benefits has been very clear. Income grew substantially, and absolute poverty declined significantly. So one statistics, we can take Millennium Development Goal as well as Sustainable Development Goals. Number one is poverty eradication, and they use the proportion of poor people below poverty line, $1.9 per person per day. That's the current international poverty line. So Asia in 1980s, if we adopted this international poverty line, around 70% people below poverty, $1.9 per person per day. But now less than 7% of poor people. So we really see a phenomenal poverty reduction in the region. And actually, a major part of this strong growth and decline of absolute poverty, we can attribute to globalization. And one example, notable example, and my favorite example is Bangladesh. Bangladesh, looking back 2 decades ago, many people talk about Bangladesh as a basket case of development. But now Bangladesh became a front runner of rapid Asian growth, even under COVID-19. Ready-made garment industry, apparel industry as a leading exporter. And this industry really absorbed a huge labor force, mainly women. And this turned into a dramatic improvement in socio-economic indicators of women. Total fertility rate dramatically declined. Infant mortality rate, especially for girls, decline. And education, primary and secondary education, now notorious gender gap became reversed. So more girls go to primary as well as secondary school. So this really remarkable transformation became possible because of the benefit of globalization by leading labor-intensive industry, namely ready-made garment industry and apparel industry. Of course, we need to worry about labor standard and the safeguard policy. Around 10 years ago, we observed very tragic Rana Plaza collapse in Bangladesh. So we need to pay close attention about the safeguards of industrialization. But largely speaking, globalization really transformed many countries in Asia into a front runner of development. So this is a benefit of globalization I would like to emphasize. And then secondly, cost of globalization we also observe after the phase of growth with equity driven by these labor-intensive exports since 1990s. Rapid growth and poverty reduction in Asia have been accompanied by rising income inequality. So technological progress as well as globalization indeed led to a rising wage differentials between skilled and less skilled workers, even though they increase income for both. So this is the second point. And finally, globalization under COVID. COVID has, not to mention, resulted in border closures, restriction, and sudden stop of globalization. This resulted in a huge loss of globalization benefit. For example, especially at the initial phase, March and April, many countries around the globe suffered from a serious shortage of PPEs, personal protective equipment, face masks, and other medical supplies. But now, international trade bounced back partially. We can enjoy access to these medical materials. Sitting in Manila in March, I had a really serious difficulty to purchase face masks. But now, if I go to the shopping mall, I can purchase plenty of face masks and variety of design, and also face shields. Cost is as low as $1 per piece. So I think this is really a gain of globalization, and we are still process of returning back to benefit of globalization. But admittedly, negative impacts persist in few areas, as Rim also mentions. Sudden losses of tourism and migration remittances. So these are really adversely affecting many countries. Fiji, Maldives, Thailand suffered a lot from losing international tourism. And also Philippines encounter sudden losses of remittance inflows. So actually, I think this is the, in this situation, I believe globalization should come back, but with a different shape. And I think in this new normal, we should support strong regional cooperation integration so that the globalization benefit can really eliminate binding constraint currently we are facing. So, and then I wanted to discuss about the digitalization, public health, and also associated with digitalization, especially taxation on digital economy and platform economy. I think that's really important challenges in post-COVID-19. But I think I will stop here, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yasu. That is really appreciated, and I think the point you make about Bangladesh is very, very interesting. It would not have been too long ago in a situation like this, or worry about Bangladesh would have been that they would have been, would they have been affected by the global flow from the north of aid money, whereas actually the biggest issue for them in this pandemic has been to continue their manufacturing and make sure that trade routes are kept open. And that, I think, shows how things are changing around the world and the different way in which globalization is affecting people and the pandemic has affected people. So thank you very much for that. The third panelist is Mr. Errol Yaiboki, who is the Deputy Director of the Project on Prosperity and Development at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies in the United States. Errol has specific research interests, including US foreign assistance, the role of the private sector in the developing world and innovation-led economic growth, but also on governance, migration, displacement, conflict-aware stabilization, which of course are huge issues in significant parts of the world that have been exacerbated by the events of 2020. He previously, as well as serving in a number of capacities inside the United States, he has long-term field experience working in Iraq, Afghanistan, South Sudan, Ethiopia, serving in a number of different roles. And he brings that experience as well as his academic work to our discussion today. So Errol, we're delighted to have you with us and look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thanks, Jack, and thanks to everyone for tuning in. I'm just, I think it's rather remarkable, not only about the 25 countries that are participating by viewing, but where we have panelists. You know, Manila, Barcelona, DC, and Jack, I believe you're in London, and I hope your AC turns back on hopefully pretty soon.
London today, but looking forward to going back to Scotland tomorrow.
Excellent, safe travels. So my fellow panelists have talked about a number of these things. So I'm not going to totally rehash everything that they've said, but I think that we need to be thinking about the impact of COVID and as an opportunity to rethink globalization. And you know, when we think about the economic challenges that Rim mentioned, those are all going to have knock-on effects for migrants. And therefore, that is going to have significant impacts on the global economy. And so when I think about human mobility and migration specifically, which is what Jack was talking about, sort of economic migration, there's four things that I'm mainly concerned about. And I hope that Jack will get to a point in the Q&A where we can talk about what we can do about this and some of the really opportunities coming out of this. But I think what I worry about is that, look, no matter where you are in the world, there's rising trends of anti-immigrant sentiment. There's populism. Right now, all of the faucets are turned off. Nobody's moving, other than Jack going from London to Scotland in confined places like that. People are not moving, and that includes labor migration, right? And so if migrants are not allowed to move and they're not able to move, then that has serious knock-on economic consequences. Migrants fill really important gaps in labor markets, in economies broadly. And if they're not able to do that, much as if, despite what populist leaders may say, native-born populations are not going to fill a lot of the jobs that are filled by migrants. Related to that is, I think that there's going to be longer term a reshuffling. So my second concern is that if there's a reshuffling in where migrants are going, take the Bangladesh example. If Bangladeshis are not able to go to the UAE and the Gulf like they were before, and they have to go to a neighboring country, say Myanmar or Thailand or India or something, maybe they'll accept jobs that have different labor standards. Maybe they'll accept jobs domestically within Bangladesh that are sort of a lower wage and higher risk category in terms of labor standards. So that's the second thing I worry about. The third thing, and Rim and Yasu have both mentioned this, but the remittance issue is a huge one. Remittances globally are higher than the total amount of foreign aid spent around the globe. So let that sink in for a second. If migrants are not able to move and they're not able to send money back to their families, then those remittance flows are going to go way, way down. And that's going to have serious, serious economic consequences, which leads me to my fourth and final point, which is that inequality is almost certainly, because of COVID, going to go up both within countries. People in places like Bangladesh, the elite of Dhaka, are able to protect themselves a lot more than the working class. That's a phenomenon that exists around the globe and between countries. And so I'm sitting here privileged enough to have a job where I can work from home and have my lovely bookcase behind me. I'm, I think, in a minority. Most of the people that are working around the world are either not working right now because of COVID, or their lives and their livelihoods have been significantly disrupted. Those of us who have the privilege of working from home, hopefully we won't lose our jobs, but even if we do, we're probably going to be okay because we have some sort of safety net involved. A lot of people, a lot of labor migrants don't have such a safety net. So in conclusion, I would say, Jack, that I'm still a believer in globalization, and I think it's the alternative is scary. The alternative to globalization is one where we're sort of everyone for themselves, and I don't think that's a viable model. But we need to take this opportunity to rethink some of the sort of pre-COVID challenges that globalization presented, its own sort of inequality challenges and everything, and there's a phrase popularized by former White House Chief of Staff Rahm Emanuel, former mayor of Chicago, don't let a crisis go to waste. And I think that there are several opportunities, which I hope we can get to in the Q&A, about not letting this crisis go to waste. As terrible as it is globally, I think that there are some opportunities for us to rethink the way that globalization benefits more people. So back over to you, Jack.
Errol, thank you very much indeed. I think that was a very good reminder of some of the lessons that we have learned this year, and perhaps have also helped many more people around the world better understand modern globalization and the impact of things like remittances, that migration is not just about people moving for a better life or to avoid conflict and violence. It is also about the impact back home, and in so many other areas. You know, I think we've educated ourselves perhaps better this year about globalization than ever before, in the midst of a crisis where the answers are not immediately obvious. I'm very struck by the fact that the first two questions in our Q&A from some of our participants today were on a similar theme, and I want to pick up on that to start off our discussion. So perhaps Rim and Yasu can both put the videos back on. They've done that. We've got everybody now back on video. And the question really is around the nature of globalization. Is there a way in which we can have a more pluralistic, more equitable, more inclusive globalization that people feel part of, and that seems at least to benefit more people and to be directly engaged with more people around the globe? And Rim, you mentioned in your initial contribution that key phrase, leave no one behind. And I think this strikes at the heart of that. And you know, I wondered if you might perhaps start off our discussion by reflecting on how can we make globalization, that I think we all feel is not just inevitable but important. How can we make sure that globalization is more relevant through a more pluralistic, inclusive, and equitable globalization? What can be done to achieve that?
One of the remarks I made was that we need to have new multilateralism models that are more inclusive. So then to become more, if they are more inclusive, they are much more resilient, because then they are underpinning a plural approach, a pluralistic approach. And then without this, I think we are moving into much more fragile systems and more frictions. I think what is important nowadays is that to learn from the past experience of globalization over the years that are since the Washington Consensus. I think the Washington Consensus was probably, it had its, say, the gains of globalization, so we cannot deny that. However, it has left many behind. And I think nowadays, these models cannot continue. So that is why a plural approach is the way forward, but then it has to be very carefully organized and regulated, because if not, it becomes much more complicated to manage, you know, these different interests and different view about economic and social models in the future.
Thank you. Yasu, from all your experience, some thoughts on this important topic?
So I think how to make globalization more inclusive and pro-poor. I think in terms of the producing side, producing goods and services, or producer side, as I illustrated by the example of Bangladesh, how to include people in production process, that's really critical. And of course, the traditional mode and traditional, maybe we can call it East Asian flying wild geese type development model, as a labor-intensive industry, and that can absorb a really large number of workforce. I think that's a traditional mode. But now I think, especially after COVID-19 outbreak, we are facing a sharper digitization of the economy. So how to make this digital economy and platform economy more inclusive, that's the critical part. And I think I see some both digital divide trend as well as digital inclusion. For example, a graph which penetrated the economy in many Asian countries, and also Gojek in Indonesia. I see lots of examples, micro and medium and you know, small scale industries really you know, developing their business because of the access to platform economy and much bigger market. So I think on one hand, there are risk of a digital divide, because of the access to the digital platform. But on the other hand, there is a huge potential to make digital economy more inclusive. So in this respect, I really feel fair competition policy play a key role in order to eliminate some unnecessary binding entry constraint for micro enterprise and small enterprise get into this huge opportunity. I think competition policy is very, very critical. So this is the producer side, and also consumer side. I think those who have access to digital platform, they can enjoy even under the stringent lockdown. They can enjoy, purchasing foods and deliveries. Also enjoy Netflix. So I think those who have access to digital really keep enjoying different services and goods. But those who are lagging behind from digital access, I think this is a serious digital divide happening in the consumer side. And especially, I think this is really serious under this schools closure. How so-called edutech platform-based or internet-based education access can replace or become substitute for conventional schooling and education. I think according to the recent UNICEF report I just saw a few days ago, 30% of kids, in school age kids, 30% are lacking access to proper internet, so that they cannot really enjoy edutech programs. So I think this digital divide from a consumer side, largely speaking, consumer side is really serious concern. And again, we need to remove these bottleneck. So I think these are the two comments from me. Thank you. Over to you.
Good, and thank you very much for that point about education. It's a very dramatic example of the impact of the lockdown and the way in which it's widened the gap sometimes between people rather than necessarily closed the gap. But these are opportunities as well in the future where, as you say, digitization can give people access to markets, but also to products in a way that they could never have had access in the past face-to-face. Errol, be interested to hear your thoughts on this topic as well. You kind of touched on it a little bit in your introductory remarks. Would you like to spell it out a bit more for us?
Yeah, definitely. And I guess my first recommendation would be if there's a cabal of people rethinking globalization from a technocratic perspective, I think Rim and Yasu should be on the list of people that are in that group. I think if that group needs someone to talk in more generalities, then I'm your man. But Jack, I think the main thing that I was thinking about when my colleagues were talking and when you were asking this question is that globalization has an image problem. Global elites love to talk about globalization and its benefits while they're at Davos, but voters don't really see it. And I'm not just talking about the United States, which this is something that's obviously playing out very viscerally here in the United States, but this is something that's, I believe, happening around the world. And so I think that there are some opportunities to reframe this, not in just a technocratic way, but we need actually to create a better narrative. And I think it's not just about words, it's about sort of demonstrating to people, not global elites, the benefits. And so Yasu mentioned a really critical one, the digital divide, especially on the education side. I think that's one way that we could absolutely demonstrate the benefits of globalization is to figure out how to get more kids tuned in. And you know, in rural parts of the United States and sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere, they don't have access to the internet. And so when you're talking about e-learning, it's not really an option, right? So that's definitely agree with Yasu on that. I think the second one, and this is going to be within the next 12 months, is I don't know how many people have read these articles about vaccines and whether they're going to come from Russia or the UK or Canada or China or wherever, trying to figure out an equitable distribution of a vaccine for COVID-19 could be the most impactful demonstration of the benefits of globalization. If coming out of COVID-19, the vaccine is only available to global elites and the rest of the population that is, oh, by the way, already disproportionately negatively affected by COVID, if they're late to get that vaccine, then we're going to have, those of us that believe in globalization and the benefits of globalization are going to have a really, really hard time. I've got some thoughts on migration as well, but those are my two key sort of what I was thinking when you were asking that question.
No, I think that's great. I think the second point there is going to be one of the great issues of the next 2 years. How this is handled by leaders, by the pharmaceutical companies as well, because they will be attached to this. By scientists
and political leaders, Jack. I mean, you know, the House of Lords in the UK is going to play a really critical role in this, and signaling, you know, that this is not just something for those of us that have the benefit of working from home, but that this is something that's more widely available.
Absolutely,
critical.
Absolutely. No, that's great points. Thank you very much for that. There were a couple of questions in the Q&A session from participants about climate, and you know, I think again, although we've been talking about the potential for a pandemic for some time, I think if we had been talking about a global crisis 12 months ago, we probably would have been talking about climate, and how to build greater resilience on climate, how to deal with the inequity of the impact of climate change, and what kind of global arrangements are needed to try and reduce emissions and save the planet. So obviously things have moved on this year with the pandemic coming to us before the worst aspects of the climate emergency. But I think in both the financial crisis of 2008 and in this particular crisis around COVID-19 in 2020, there have been question marks over the global institutions that were there to deal with these kind of shocks, and the resilience that they had built into systems beforehand, and their sharpness in responding. Next year we have the pleasure in the UK of hosting COP26, so there'll be further discussions on climate targets. But I think one of the issues that will presumably come out of this year's events will be, you know, how can we create and then trust global institutions or global frameworks that will help us be more resilient and take the appropriate action and then implement that action equitably on the major crises that we will continue to face as a planet, whether that's economic shocks or it's health shocks, or perhaps the next big significant changes might well be the further development of climate shocks. So I'm interested to know where you are on that as panelists, and maybe I'll come to Yasu first on this from the Asian side of things. You know, I think Japan in particular has been a great leader in discussing climate finance and pushing the G20 to take climate seriously and so on. And obviously some of the nations of Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean are particularly affected by climate, Pacific are particularly affected by climate change. So Yasu, would you like to perhaps start our discussion on this point?
Yes. Climate is a critical, one of the most critical elements of a post-COVID recovery. And some people said green, you know, building back better is a term adopted by a Sendai conference of disaster prevention a few years ago. But now people are talking about building back greener. And I think this is a very important concept when it comes to the COVID-19 recovery. Admittedly, Asia in the past growth, although I highlighted phenomenal Asian growth led by a labor-intensive, inclusive development model, but actually, admittedly, Asian growth has been a little bit dirty in terms of CO2 emission and in terms of climate aspects. So I think already before COVID-19, how to achieve you know, more climate friendly development mode. I think that has been a very, very important agenda. So that's why G20 Japan hosted last year put climate change as one of the main agenda. And actually, ADB, we did a special report 3 years ago on infrastructure investment needs assessment. So I think for better climate resilience, I think there are two investment in infrastructure needed. One is mitigation, so switching from dirty energy source to cleaner renewable energy source. And the other aspect is investment in resilience to build up adaptation capacity. These are important. So according to our estimate, Asia and Pacific developing countries and economies need 1.7 trillion US dollars per year. That level of investment is really necessary in order to achieve Paris climate goal and also continue Asian growth at the same time and poverty reduction trend. So I think this is the really important from the angle of further investment for mitigation adaptation. And indeed, MDBs, including ADB, have been working on climate change and climate resilience agenda, really supporting quite strongly. And ADB adopted next 10-year strategy 2030 2 years ago. And we have a 7 priority. One of the priority is climate change and disaster resilience. So already we set this next 10-year goal. And the ADB is supporting especially energy sector and transport sector. Roughly speaking, 1/4 of ADB's lending portfolio going to the energy, another 1/4 goes to transport. I think making more climate friendly will help mitigation on the energy side and adaptation for transport side. So that's one example we are working to help achieve climate goals. And also ocean health. This became one of the pillars of our supporting disaster resilience and climate change. So, so this is the discussion I'd like to share with you.
Thank you very much. Rim, I mean, obviously, there have been a lot of discussions in Europe and I suppose in the Euromed region as well about a green and just recovery, about building back better and so on, and some cooperation between the financial institutions in Europe and the EU, the European Commission on this. And how, do you feel as if this is going somewhere? Is it going to be warm words, or are we going to see the sort of action that's required across a wide enough spread of countries and institutions to make a real difference?
As I mentioned, I think the Green Deal of the European Union is a way forward. Obviously, with a global pandemic, this green transition will be accelerated, surely. So this acceleration is good news for the climate change targets. And I think Germany, especially, and other member states are really moving into that direction of cleaning the economies. Now, what I wanted also to share is the role of financial markets. I mean, banking, institution, asset managers, and insurance companies. And these are really key players to accelerate this green transition and to clean the economies without really what we call the greenwashing, because nowadays, you know, the transition for them costs a lot of money. So the needs for capital because of greening, you know, of the transition cost will be quite high. And this might be nowadays an obstacle for accelerating the green transition. So, for example, at the European Banking Authority, we have a working group specifically on sustainable finance, and our approach, and at least our advice to the European authorities, is to really push as hard as possible, even with motivation in terms of you know, discounts and so on and so forth. For example, for the in terms of capital requirements and so on, to, in fact, accelerate the green transition, because Europe is in reality taking the lead on this. Now, having the Euromed, or call it the Euro-Mediterranean and also Euro-Africa partnership, should be also based on this Green Deal, because we are moving now accelerated into what I call the previous Paris target on decarbonization. And I think this is a great opportunity to move it faster. Again, that's my.
Do you think the scope, Rim, in one of the questioners has asked, is there scope to build almost an alliance of friendly nations or blocs around the world to push this Green New Deal more effectively? Obviously, in Europe, there is that degree of clarity amongst most of the members of the EU and their neighbours, and there are other places in the world where there are strong commitments, or at least strong words. Is there scope, perhaps, to have a sort of global alliance of friends of the Green New Deal who could push this forward, involving perhaps the likes of South Korea, Japan, Canada, maybe one or two other places that are maybe going to move in the right direction at some point?
That will certainly help, especially against the others who wouldn't want to move fast. So more unity on the side of greening the global economy will certainly enhance the trust in the future model of globalization.
Yeah. Errol, you've mentioned migration a few times, and you've worked in places where a lot of the migration that we've seen recently in Europe, and indeed in North America as well, and actually across North Africa and Central Africa, between different countries, not just to Europe and North America, where we've seen people coming from. And we tend to associate a lot of that migration with people leaving violent conflict these days, rather than perhaps what would have been seen maybe 30 years ago as people leaving behind famine or humanitarian crisis. But actually climate is becoming more and more of a driver of this as well, isn't it? That people are being pushed from their land as a result of climate change. So this might be an appropriate moment maybe to say something more about migration flows, and is the pandemic of 2020 going to increase migration flows or decrease migration flows? And what kind of action should we be looking to in global institutions that might help improve the trust that people have in the judgments that are made around migration in the developing world, and are currently fueling a lot of the political debate that we see?
Yeah, those are great questions, and thanks to whoever asked that question, because I think climate action is, as Rim just alluded to, is one of the ways that we can actually demonstrate the benefits of globalization. I think what you've seen to date is that it kind of demonstrates some of the challenges with globalization, and one of the challenges being that action by a country like the United States is driven as much by politics as by science, if not more. And so just as a quick aside to address the elephant in the room, the United States should absolutely rejoin Paris, and we should actually get on the team with the rest of the world. So that aside, I think the migration thing is really interesting. So there's two parts to what you just said there, Jack. One is COVID-19 related. And so my fear is that we are going to have, people have gone home. Bangladeshis who are in the Middle East have gone home. People who were in Delhi and Mumbai have gone back to their villages. People are sort of waiting, for lack of a better word. Some people are stuck in the countries where they are, but there's not as much work because economies in developed countries are also suffering under COVID. And so what you're going to see, I think, is whenever there is a vaccine that's widely available and we start to, reopen, whatever that means, I think you're going to have historically high levels of people wanting to move and historically high barriers to movement. Because what populist governments have done is they have erected barriers using COVID as an excuse. It happens in our country. The Trump administration has used COVID as an excuse to push forward other anti-immigrant policies that they probably wanted to do for a while, and it's not unique to the United States. You're seeing this in Hungary and Turkey and some other places. So that's a challenge, I think. It is, related to one of your questions. On the climate stuff, this is, again, an opportunity to demonstrate how globalization could work better is in migration. And there's two parts to this. One relates to the climate, one doesn't. The one that doesn't relate to climate, the part that doesn't relate to climate is really, we need to be thinking about the benefits. We need to be thinking about migration, not in terms of what are we going to do to stop it, both at its roots and once people come to the borders, but how we can manage it. Because whether people are moving legally or regularly or safely or not, they're going to be moving. And for reasons, Jack, that you mentioned, there's increasing amounts of conflict, some of which can be tied back to climate, some of which is not. People are going to be moving, whether it's for those sort of forced displacement reasons or elsewhere. And so either we come up with a system that allows for better, regular, and orderly and safe migration, as is talked about in the Global Compact on migration, or we are going to just see increased levels of irregular migration, people moving through the shadows. And I think that's how we respond to that is going to determine a big part of how people see globalization. Quickly on the climate stuff, I think there's also an opportunity here. I'm writing a paper on this now, and so I'll try not to give away too much of the special sauce that's going to come out in this paper in about a month. But the gist is that there are a lot of people who are being forced to leave home due to climate change related events. That word salad is basically because you can't say that climate change caused this person to move. Climate change contributed to a lot of the underlying reasons why people decide to move, but those reasons are complex, they're multifaceted. And so obviously addressing the climate crisis will have a huge positive impact on people, for example, living in coastal communities that won't have to move. But there's these sort of secondary and third order desertification and other types of climate challenges that are exacerbating the violent conflict that then forces people from home.
Thank you very much. So it's sometimes very easy when we're sitting in Europe, and I think also this is true for North America often. When we think about divides in the world between rich and poor, we tend to think about Europe and Africa, or in North America, sometimes perhaps also thinking about maybe Central America, the Caribbean, or whatever, places closer to home. And I think sometimes we don't fully accept the scale today of the divides between rich and poor across East Asia, Southeast Asia, and so on. However much a lot of these economies are still developing in some sense, in Southeast Asia, for example, there are issues of real inequity in your part of the world just as much as there are in our part of the world and between our part of the world and the global south. And I wonder about this issue of migration and equity and the impact that it has on trust. Does it have an impact in China or Indonesia or India, the Philippines? I'm very struck by the fact that it was this movement towards national leaders who were from outside the political system, or at least outside the political elites, really started in your part of the world. Indonesia, the Philippines, and elsewhere were ahead of the United States and many European countries in electing leaders who came from outside the mainstream. And it seemed to me at the time that was reflecting a degree of anger amongst the population at the inequity and the standard of government in the system. And I just wondered if you have any reflections on how that impacts on this issue of the perception of globalization from where you're sitting at the moment. Yeah, Sue.
Thank you very much. That's an interesting question. So maybe I can discuss about role of trust and also how trust are affected in this post-COVID situation. I think conceptually, trust play a key role. COVID-19 is a typical health epidemic or a global pandemic, which generated large-scale negative externalities. So negative externality that cannot be basically handled by market mechanisms. So that's why public actions are needed. So market failure, so public actions. But at the same time, this pandemic is a global pandemic crossing a national border. So single country's effort cannot really sufficiently handle this pandemic. So I would say government also, to some extent, fail. So market failure, government failure, then what shall we do? I think people's perception, people's cooperation, and voluntary collaboration, cooperation, these play a very important role, and the trust play a really core element of supporting people's voluntary cooperation, which can at least partially mitigate market failure and government failure. So in that sense, trust, or broadly speaking, I would say social capital play a very, very important role. So public health, cross-border contact tracing and quarantine, and also early warning system for disease should be set up regionally, not within a single country, but also cross-border, and also availability of essential medicine, and also Errol touch upon the vaccines, development of vaccines, and also supplying of vaccines. This is really involve big externality, and also there is a stronger nature of public goods. So I think government failure, market failure should be really supported by trust and social capital. But unfortunately, COVID-19 by nature, social distancing is needed. So I think a physical distance really undermine accumulation of social capital under this difficult situation. So I think this is, from the academic viewpoint, this is a really intriguing situation. On one hand, we need to really build up to tackle this global pandemic, but on the other hand, physical distancing required from health angle really undermines keeping and accumulating social capital. But largely speaking, I think private sector and Asian economy as a whole really pragmatic and has been really market-oriented pragmatism leading Asian growth. And I think even under the situation of COVID-19, this effective role of markets really play a key role. So, complementary between a market and social capital really strong still under COVID-19 situation. So although there is some risk of inward orientation triggered by COVID-19, but I think broader sectors and vast majority of people in Asia really try to cooperate and collaborate in order to fulfill market failure and government failure. So that's what has been happening, and also all the policies seems to be effective to support the private sector and enhancing cooperative behavior. So I think that's really intriguing question you postulated, and this is my some quick response to your question.
Very intriguing answer as well. So lots to think about there, I think. Rim, there's been a couple of questions in the Q&A about sustainable development and about particularly in relation to the global south. Someone in particular asking about Sierra Leone, but more general questions about developing countries and how can we ensure that coming out of these difficulties this year, we have more sustainable economic models. And I wonder, both from your experience in the private sector, but also your knowledge as an economist, we talked earlier about Build Back Better and a Green Deal, but there are so many places in the world which are so far behind that even a Green Deal sounds like something that's very far away. So do you have any thoughts on how we can ensure in this new era that as national economies, local economies in the developing world come out of this lockdown period, that we can help them strengthen to be more resilient to these sort of shocks in the future, close some of the equity gaps?
Yes, certainly the SDGs play a very important role in terms of inclusion and sustainability, and we have talked about it already. So these developing countries, they have the possibility to develop their countries better within this philosophy of inclusion and sustainability. But beyond this, I think what we've seen, for example, in Africa and some countries in the Middle East, we've seen the case of Lebanon and others, they are over-indebted. So their model of growth, in fact, is a bit hampered by the high stock of debt. So this high stock of debt, while you have an economic crisis that has become a kind of an endogenous economic crisis because of the pandemic, would reduce the capacity of these countries to grow with this stock of pile of debt. So that is why there has been a large debate about debt relief by the international organizations, Paris Club and others. Now, the problem I see there is, yes, right, it is important to reduce the debt, the stock of debt in these countries, but at the same time, you need to adhere to other principles of transparency, because it's not a matter of piling debt and then, over borrowing in the future to enhance your growth possibilities. So adding to the SDGs, I think it's important to have what I call the transparency paradigm embedded not only on the governance level, but also on economic level and social level. And I think this would add, in fact, to a better view of where is the debt and where is it invested in reality. So it's not only invested in the public sector, which probably would not create great value, but rather into infrastructure development. And that is why I said it's important to accelerate the digital transition. So the digital transition is the backbone of a transparency also in that term for example, establishing e-governance, government and e-governance systems that are clear to everybody. Another principle, which I think is extremely important, is responsibility. So citizen responsibility, governance responsibility, and also all other economic actors' responsibility. Because at the end of the day, a pluralist system, it's where all the stakeholders contribute to economic growth and economic sustainability and resilience. And what we have seen, for example, in this crisis, the pandemic, that, okay, we are struggling to have global solidarity. So yes, there might be pockets of regional solidarity, but I think we need to probably move a bit further. And this also the second pillar for regaining trust for globalization. And that is why I said, I think the role of multinational organizations, like for example, the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO and all of this, have a crucial role nowadays to move back or to push back this globalization to another vision and this correct this image that you mentioned is a probable image prior to COVID-19, but then we could correct this image, anchoring the global solidarity mechanisms, which can even go beyond, I think we can even think of global social protection schemes for the most vulnerable and the segments of the populations that are completely left behind.
Thank you very much, Rim. I want to just briefly touch on one other issue before we come to any closing remarks, and that's the issue of conflict. Errol, I'm conscious that you have worked in a number of conflict and fragile environments, and if we're talking about trusting international institutions, their record at the moment in bringing conflict to an end or preventing conflict has not been particularly successful. And I wondered if you had any reflections on that, because I think that's one of the things that has eroded confidence in international institutions over recent years, is that people can see these horrific conflicts taking place around the world, but they struggle to see the global community intervening in a way that actually prevents or brings it to an end. Errol.
I teach a class at the Syracuse Maxwell School, a graduate school course, and last night it's on fragility and fragile states, and last night we did an exercise that I called stakeholder mapping, where I assigned each 22 student a different stakeholder group from fragile states. And so there was Chinese business, and there was NGOs, and there was bilateral donors, and the World Bank and the IMF, and sort of everybody that's involved in this. And so the answer to your question is it's really complicated, because all of those different stakeholder groups have different agendas, and this is part of the problem. This is part of the sort of trust deficit that exists. And so I think one general point from my own experience and just the research that I've done more recently is, to the extent that these efforts to create peace can be locally led and can involve women at the decision-making level, those seem to be two very, very definitive sort of points. Liberia is a prime example of both of those in play. And so I think local civil society driven, lots of women involved in the peace building process, from just the sort of peace building perspective, I think is critical. I think the international community really comes in on the aid side, and fragile states are unable to, in a lot of places, sort of take care of vulnerable people. And so I think we as the international community have a role to play in the peace building, but more as a convener and sort of neutral space for locals to sort it out. I think what's happened in reality has been that the international community has come in and said, this is the way that it's going to be, or these are our ideas for how to fix it. And I think that ends up in ceasefires, not peace processes.
Yep. Absolutely. Very good point. So maybe a discussion for another day. We can leave that one with the Victoria Forum to
look forward to it.
Invite us back for that. Okay, I'm conscious we have about 5 minutes for three outstanding speakers who have a million things to say in closing remarks. So I'm going to ask each of the three panelists to leave us with one point that they would want each of us to take away from the discussion more than any other. We've heard so many insights from all three panelists that there's a lot to try and think about afterwards. But I'll start with Dr. Sawada first, and I'll ask each of the three in turn to give us one particular insight that they would want us to go away and think about as we leave this particular webinar today. Yasu, you go first.
So I think globalization will come back after COVID, and but a different shape. And emerging economy, including Asian countries, must seize this renewed opportunity to build up stronger regional cooperation integration, so that the maximizing benefit of globalization. So health arena, as I briefly mentioned, cross-border regional public goods building up is really necessary, including some quarantine system and vaccines, medical equipment, trade, etc., etc. On top of this, finance and investment, social safety net, and travel and tourism, that should be a part of this building up a new globalization from a regional perspective. The other thing is globalization and probably platform digitizations are moving hand in hand. So, and as we discussed, digitization may inevitably leads to digital divide and increasing inequality. So I think we need some framework to correct this inevitable digital divide. Government should provide social protection policy and the labor supporting policy, as well as some type of income redistribution policy. So especially I'd like to point digital economy, profit shifting and base erosion of profit shifting is a major concern. So I think strengthening taxation system across the national border and coordinated effort for tax agreements, I think that's really important, again, to maximize the benefit of a new mode of globalization.
Well done. You managed to mention about 10 issues there in one answer. Did very well. Excellent. Thank you very much. Errol, you go next. What's your one thing you want us to think about?
I'm the migration guy on the panel, so I'm going to give you a migration answer. I think COVID presents an opportunity to rethink migration as a way of rebuilding trust in globalization. I think a new system should address the shocks that increase outmigration. We talked about several of them: conflict, climate change, economic collapse, etc. But ultimately, we need to engage with it. We need to better understand it, and we need to not just focus on stopping it, which won't work anyways.
Excellent point. And Rim, I mean, again, can we just thank you very much for your for EMEA's sponsorship support for this forum and this webinar. It's been a fascinating webinar. So we'll give the last word to you before we hand back to our hosts.
Thank you very much. COVID-19 is a global pandemic. So the right global policy response, which is based on global solidarity, will drive a global economic growth and job creation that leaves no one behind. And this type of model should be and must be transparent, inclusive, sustainable, and resilient. And I think this is pretty much a great opportunity to move or to change the image of globalization.
Fabulous. Thank you very much to all three of you. That has been incredibly interesting for me. I'm sure it has been for the people from around the world who've joined us today to listen and take part. And I feel immensely privileged to have had the opportunity to keep the panel moving over the course of the last hour and 15 minutes. So I'd like to hand back now to Adele, who I think is going to wrap things up for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. It is a privilege and an honor actually to.
A bientôt, Adele.
Say again, sorry?
A bientôt, Adele.
Yeah. Thank you. So it is my pleasure and privilege actually to close this very interesting discussion. And I'm sorry actually to cut it short because I think there are a lot of very interesting ideas that you are talking about. J'espère que vous pouvez me joindre pour remercier ce panel extraordinaire. Please join me and react. You can use the different Zoom reaction if you would like to thank this amazing and honorable panel who guided us through a very interesting conversation about globalization. And I would like to use this opportunity to invite the panelists to continue the conversation during the Victoria Forum, the virtual Victoria Forum in November. And one of the ideas is maybe to have a roundtable discussion or workshop to really shape a number of practical solutions moving forward. Merci beaucoup aux champions, Dean Saul Klein and Professor Rim Ayadi for putting this webinar together. They did an amazing job in convincing the panelists and putting forward the questions. On remercie la participation et le partenariat avec la Fondation Asie-Pacifique du Canada et l'Association euro-méditerranéenne des économistes for partnering with us on this webinar. The next webinar on September 17th is going to be a very interesting discussion about the future of doing business and banking. And as you can see, it builds on the conversation we had so far, including the one that we're talking about now on the globalization. So we will talk not just only about the how businesses are changing, but also how we rethink the role of banking, because we have been talking about finance, but it's really important to start also thinking about the services to people. And then on October 1st, we're bringing to you another webinar on the conversions between private and public investment for sustainable international development. And on October 15th, it will be a webinar on bridging the gender divides. And please stay tuned for the announcements. But we invite you actually to visit our website for more information. Comme j'ai dit, novembre 12 au 14, on aura le Virtual Victoria Forum. C'est sur 3 jours, mais il y aura un nombre de panel discussions, roundtable think tank, with the idea of shaping a number of recommendations, concrete recommendations for policymakers, for businesses, for civil society to address the issues facing us. We are proud of our partnership with the Senate of Canada for all these series of webinars and the Victoria Forum in 2020 and 2021. And we thank the support of TELUS and Van City, without whom we cannot really make these happen. So please be engaged and join the conversation. Thank you.